Those that arrive first, obviously the Americans, and take control, obtain the resources they are seeking in the form of data. Who understands this very, very well now, better than any other political leader in the world? Donald Trump. Donald Trump wants a US monopoly of data and data centers. So the US should rule all the major data centers in the world and control the data amassed by these data centers. This is essential. This is another facet of techno-feudalism. Big government, big tech, this marriage, right? The key point is that whatever the original business, Google, Amazon, Uber, the strategies of conquering cyberspace all point to the same target. Take control of, between commas, spaces of observation and capture of data.
Today we're going to be talking about techno-feudalism. Now, for many of you, this is the first time you're ever hearing of the term. But I would argue that techno-feudalism is one of the most central developments of the 2020s. And if you want to understand society, economics, and geopolitics going forward, you need to understand what techno-feudalism is. And to help us deconstruct this term, we're very pleased to welcome a longtime friend of the program and one of the people who have been very early on this techno-feudalism game, who have been writing about this for years, and who can help it break it down better than anyone else. Pepe, thank you so much for joining us today.
My pleasure, Dimitri.
Pepe has come prepared. He has brought the receipts. So we're going to be doing a truly deep dive. Okay, so let's start with the most fundamental question. What is techno-feudalism and how does it differ from conventional capitalism?
Let's say it's the shortest definition. The meeting between big government and big tech. But what we have now in the US is something slightly different. It's big government by a very peculiar interpretation of government, which is Trump's. And of course, big tech. We all remember at the inauguration, big tech, they had a special role at the inauguration, and most of them were there. But this has been going on for quite a while, and this is what we could deep dive in our conversation, because actually this started at least 40 years ago, if not 50 years ago. And of course, it's an American government initiative involving DARPA, involving major agencies, involving renaming Facebook, which was a different program before it was called Facebook. And I learned a lot about that on the spot. And that's why I like to quote some stuff from 40 years ago, which is crazy for many of our viewers. Because in 1986, I went on a huge tour of the US, especially from Silicon Valley to Boston and MIT, on artificial intelligence already. And
that was in 1986.
Yeah, that was 40. It's crazy, Dimitri. That was 40 years ago. It was my second year as a foreign correspondent, and I got this crazy assignment. And I said, wow, will I be up to it? It took me a month and a half, in fact, of traveling, but I was very, very lucky. I was introduced by an Italian scientist, and he opened very, very good doors for me, especially at MIT and some people in Berkeley as well. So then I wrote this enormous expose at the time, which obviously was lost in space because it was published in Brazil at the time. Very few people read it. But then I used it again for Asia Times when I was with Asia Times a few years ago. And it's included in my previous book, Raging 20s, which, by the way, the subtitle, we see techno-feudalism.
Yeah.
And at the time, there were not many people in the English-speaking world talking directly about techno-feudalism and trying to explain it. And then in late 2020, a researcher at the Sorbonne in Paris, he comes out with a little book called Techno-feudalism. And I was floored. I said, wow, this guy is ahead of everybody else, conceptualizing in a French way. It's a very serious book. But I see he got lost in the middle with the details and especially the backstory. And for the backstory, you have to go back to what was happening in the US, especially in the 60s, 70s, and early 80s. This is something we can talk about.
Yeah, but I mean, before we dive into the history, what is techno-feudalism? What are its characteristic traits, and how does it differ from what we've seen before, the previous economic systems that dominate the West?
It's dominated by essentially artificial intelligence. And that's why figures like Elon Musk are so crucial now. It's a bit blunt to define Elon Musk as a techno-feudalist, Maybe this is what he would like to be. But he is one of the key characters because now Trump made Musk the link between his government and big tech. So this, by definition, is already a facet of techno-feudalism. And we have a tech geek running parts of the US administration now. This is something we never seen before, right? And of course, the fact that Elon Musk has different contracts with the deep state, everything from Starlink to SpaceX, you don't get these contracts out of nowhere in the US. You lived in Washington, you know how it works, right? You have to be one of them, and they have to trust you. Because the way SpaceX and Starlink work, Musk can do whatever he wants and sell to whoever he wants without supervision. This is unique. And artificial intelligence is key in all that. We're going to see, because I'm going to quote to all of you guys, one of the fathers of artificial intelligence, the great Marvin Minsky. And I was beyond lucky to meet Minsky at MIT in '86. He took me to the cafeteria and he gave me the definitive definition of artificial intelligence. And I also met at the time people who were very skeptical about artificial intelligence. So now we have in the Anglo-American sphere, a lot of scientists which are very enthusiastic about artificial intelligence, some who are like Professor Geoffrey Hinton, British. He's considered by many as I wouldn't say the father, but perhaps the godfather of AI, but he came after Minsky. He says that artificial intelligence is going to control all of us soon, and it's irreversible. And many scientists say, no, this is basically programming. It depends on who's programming it, which is absolutely correct. And there are definitions of AI is as intelligent as the guy who wrote the code, which is particularly interesting. But then we have the possibility, which was already evoked by Arthur Clarke and Stanley Kubrick, in probably the best science fiction movie of all time, 2001, that AI may start having its own ideas. I cannot do this, Dave. That's HAL, the computer, in 2001. Can you imagine? And this was in the late 60s as well. So I would say the lineaments of what AI could be were already present in the late 60s, but nobody's talking about it. And now AI, as you know, is all the rage all over the world because of a small Chinese company that comes up with a model that is better than the Silicon Valley models.
So when we say that basically techno-feudalism is ruled by AI.
Essentially. Something very important, Dimitri, is the beginning of the digital age. How did it start? And this is outstanding because very few people know about an organization called Progress and Freedom Foundation. It was active from 93 to 2010, funded by, very important, Microsoft, AT&T, Disney, Sony, Oracle, Google, and Yahoo. What this PFF organization did, it's extraordinary. In 1994, that's a very important date, they had a groundbreaking conference in Atlanta. And out of this conference came what we could define as the Magna Carta of the digital age. Literally. And that's the name of their report. Cyberspace and the American Dream, a Magna Carta for the knowledge era. This thing was published in 1996 during the first Clinton term. And then this brings us to the magazine Wired, which was the Bible of the digital age in the 80s, especially. It was founded the same year of the PFF, 1993. That's the beginning of Wired magazine. And this magazine, Wired, became what we could call the house organ, what many people, even in the US, call the Californian ideology, which is the same as Silicon Valley. So two of the guys essential to writing this Magna Carta, I'm sure our audience will make an instant connection, at least with one of them. The futurist Alvin Toffler, who wrote Future Shock, which was a mega Bible for even lay people in the 80s. And the former scientific counselor Ronald Reagan, George Keyworth. So these are the names, it's very important. These are the guys behind the conceptualization of the digital age at the top levels of the American government. Yeah? They were conceptualizing how, and now I'm quoting the report, cyberspace is a bioelectronic environment which is literally universal. I see this as something extraordinary. This is exceptionalism applied to the digital age by people very high up in the American government. So this Magna Carta was saying that We, the privileged, have the right to this the control of this universal digital age. And everything that we're living now comes from this Magna Carta.
What does that mean in practice, right? Like, how do the techno-feudalists want to use AI to govern us? And, why is this, application of AI in some ways equivalent to feudalism?
Because it's ruled by, let's say, a very rarefied class of landlords or digital landlords with very specific agendas. In the case of Musk, for instance, we don't know exactly what Elon Musk thinks. We know his projects, we know the application of the different industries he's involved in, but we don't know exactly his social vision, or if he has a social vision. Same applies to Bezos, Zuckerberg, all these people. So it's very dangerous because when you have a government actually attributing to these people the power to conduct a tech revolution, we are also subordinated to the way they see the world and the way they envision social relations. And for that, Dimitri, we have to go back to the role of Ayn Rand.
Yeah.
This is absolutely essential. Ayn Rand, as many of you will remember, she declared that egotism is good, altruism is evil, and empathy is irrational. This is something that we could attribute with different degrees to many of these tech giants. They are not interested in, I would say, a socialist, collectivist way of living in the world. No, this is the mega entrepreneur as leader, which in the case of Trump is no wonder that he likes Musk, because Musk is the ultimate mega entrepreneur, and a tech mega entrepreneur, right? So where does that lead us? Google, Facebook, Uber, and all that, they are able to overstep any legal framework, which is what's scaring the Europeans to that. The Europeans at the European Commission in Brussels, as we know, they are anal retentive on laws and circumscribing everything. There's nothing they can do essentially against American big tech. So they impose all these innovations as a sort of fait accompli. That's it. We invented how you're going to transact with other people in our social networks, and that's it. And there's no other way. That's why it's so dangerous. So this is a form of feudalism because they are imposing a vision of social relations. So now everybody assumes all over the world that the way you conduct social relations is looking at your screen all the time. So this is the death of person-to-person interactions. This is the death of critical thinking. This is the death of literature, or actually reading, and reading long pieces and long texts and all that, substituted by this instant frenetic interaction. And obviously this came out from Silicon Valley.
I totally get what you're saying, because I think many of our viewers have heard the now infamous OpenAI CEO Sam Altman's quote,
yes,
that AI will force us to rethink the social contract between governments and societies. And when you look at a lot of the way of their rhetoric, it seems that they basically view us as lab rats in their elaborate scientific experiment.
Yes.
And I actually think that's one of the reasons why this quote unquote new techno-feudalism is much worse than medieval feudalism, because the idea of medieval feudalism was based on the idea of reciprocal duties and reciprocal obligations, right?
Exactly.
So obviously peasants had obligations to, their lords. They had to pay certain taxes. They had to give certain loyalty. They had to serve in the army. But the lords also had obligations to peasants. They had to provide protection. They had to provide land. They had, in many cases, to provide certain public services. For example, building churches, building roads, wells, providing certain community infrastructure, and so on and so forth. Whereas in the case of these tech CEOs, they don't view any sort of idea of reciprocal obligation. No. They just sort of view human beings as a resource to be squeezed for building ever more advanced versions of AI.
Exactly. And we can say that this is ultra high-tech artificial intelligence neoliberalism, in fact. This is neoliberalism on tech steroids, if we could put it this way, One of the things at the time when I was trying to take a look at these Randian heroes, which are the prototypes of the current Bezos, Zuckerberg, Elon Musk, etc. The history of Silicon Valley is totally dependent on US intervention, state intervention, which is something that a lot of people all over the world have no idea about. So our audience, I wonder if many people are familiar with the Ames Research Center. This is one of NASA's top top labs in Mountain View, California, which was essential to the development of Silicon Valley. During World War II, Hewlett-Packard was flourishing thanks to their electronics being used to manufacture radars. This was also very, very important. During the 60s, the US military bought the bulk of the still infant semiconductor production in the US. Semiconductor production in the US was practically nothing, but it was already controlled by the government in the early 60s. And then, very, very important, 2006 MIT Technological Review report. What do they say? This report is called The Rise of Data Capital. So this was only 9 years ago, right? Guess who wrote the report? It was in partnership with Oracle. So we have Allison, the owner of Oracle, directly involved, his own interest, right? Digital networks open access to a new virgin underground brimming with resources. And I'm quoting this MIT report. Those that arrive first, obviously the Americans, and take control, obtain the resources they're seeking in the form of data. Who understands this very, very well now, better than any other political leader in the world? Donald Trump. Donald Trump wants a US monopoly of data and data centers. So the US should rule all the major data centers in the world and control the data amassed by these data centers. This is essential. This is another facet of techno-feudalism. Big government, big tech, this marriage, right? Something very important, it is also quoted in this report. Google made Android free for all smartphones so it would acquire a strategic market position. And this the Americans do better than anybody else. Control the market, right? The key point is that whatever the original business, Google, Amazon, Uber, the strategies of conquering cyberspace all point to the same target. Take control of, between commas, spaces of observation and capture of data. So this could be another definition that you asked me about of techno-feudalism. You control all these spaces and the interstices of these spaces, all observing, capturing, monopolizing, and then rentabilizing data. So for the techno-feudalists, all of us, we are a data mine for them. So that's why they need to learn everything that we do, literally. And that's why when we are on our smartphones, we are, as among others, Snowden, over 10 years ago, he was saying what everybody suspected, but then he had data to prove it. We are under total observation in everything that we do.
Let me play devil's advocate.
Of course, of course.
I'm imagining that I would be a libertarian at the Ayn Rand Institute or the Cato Institute or, I don't know, one of these other globalist entities, right?
Yes.
And the argument I would make is that, yes, all these big tech companies collect your data, but they do it for your own good, right? Because, more advanced AI is able to offer you better technological experience, do better recommendations, all that sort of stuff. And oh, by the way, look at this rising GDP chart. Clearly, big tech has been good for America and for humanity by pushing innovation, by creating new platforms, new mediums of expression. Big tech is good. Techno-feudalism is good for humanity.
Mm-hmm. Well, this is a typical Ayn Rand way of thinking because it elevates the big tech entrepreneur as the hero and not a working class hero, to quote John Lennon, or the average man. No, and it's obviously not by accident that Trump is elevating Musk to this larger than life figure now. Now he is the ultimate hero entrepreneur, a benign hero entrepreneur, as you just mentioned. He's doing this to the good of all of us, just like having X as a platform of free expression all over the world. Of course, if they don't like it, they can still cancel some accounts, you see? So it all goes back to Ayn Rand. This is really, it's very, very impressive. And that's why the book by this researcher from the Sorbonne, when it came out, this book came out in late 2020. It was probably the first one. It's still not translated into English. And in France, he had a very limited distribution. It's a pity because he outlined some of the background. But basically, this was the first political criticism of the digital age. And this is something we don't see all around, and not only in Anglo-American sphere, everywhere. We haven't seen so far a detailed criticism of the political economy of the digital age.
Well, let's provide that criticism because, again, I laid out the sort of big tech supporter argument that this is all good for humanity, this is progress, this is innovation, this is economic development. What's really the negative side of it? Why should we be concerned about this sort of looming AI revolution and, the fact that big tech wants to harvest our data?
So probably, Dimitri, we could try to go back to our friend Marvin Minsky. And I have a date to provide to all of you, our audience. Do you know when artificial intelligence was actually invented? 1956. So it's been there for, practically 70 years, right? And obviously in the first 2 decades, nobody was talking about it, except, for instance, John McCarthy at Stanford and our friend Marvin Minsky at MIT. And when the basic idea came up, Minsky, he was a student in Harvard. Then he went to the MIT. At the MIT lab, when I went to the MIT lab and then actually met with Marvin Minsky, there was also another guy called Joseph Weizenbaum. Very, very important. He coined the term artificial intelligence, in fact. The term came from him. And he believed that computers could never think just like a human being. So there were skeptics already at the beginning. The guys who invented the concept and started to do the first experiments, they were already skeptical. You see, that's very, very important. And then at Stanford, a guy called Edward Feigenbaum, he was absolutely paranoid about Japanese progress. I'm sure many of you will remember that in the 80s, the Americans saying, well, Japanese tech will take over the world, just like they're paranoid about the Chinese now. And Feigenbaum, he believed that if the Japanese developed the 5th generation computer based on artificial intelligence, that could reason and speak even a difficult language as Japanese, and I'm quoting him, the US will be able to build itself as the first great post-industrial agrarian society. So we can see that these geniuses at the time, they were deeply skeptical about AI from the beginning. You see? Okay, but I want to find the definitive quote by Minsky when we had that conversation at the MIT cafeteria. I'm quoting him. I believe that in less than 5 centuries, we'll be producing machines very similar to us. So you see, they were thinking in terms of 5 centuries, not 5 years or 5 decades, representing our thoughts and point of view. If we can build a miniaturized human brain weighing, let's say, 1 gram, we can lodge it in a spaceship and make it travel at the speed of light. It would be very hard to build a spaceship to carry an astronaut and all his food for 10,000 years of travel. So you see, you could see that they were diffident and they use sense of humor, but they say, okay, we came up with this concept, we're doing the experiments, but this is not going to go very far. Because ultimately it depends on who is programming who is programming what, right? DARPA, very, very important, Dimitri. DARPA was always about computer science. And in the mid-80s, at the time where people were starting to talk about artificial intelligence, they were immersed in a very ambitious program linking microelectronics, computer architecture, and AI already. So at the time, as I can recall, nobody was talking about this, only in scientific magazines, at best, So, and this was comparable to the Japanese 5th generation computer program. This is something that I took from my notes. At MIT, the overwhelming majority of scientists were huge DARPA cheerleaders, obviously because they were getting financing for their experiments, right? Another quote, very, very important, and this is by a guy in Berkeley, Hubert Dreyfus. He said, computers cannot think like human beings because there's no way to represent all retrospective knowledge of an average human life. Retrospective knowledge is absolutely essential. It's something that great poets, for instance, T.S. Eliot has outstanding images about, the backward half look over the shoulder. And he says, towards the primitive terror. This is retrospective knowledge. When you look behind you and you have all the accumulated knowledge of mankind and you have to deal with it, and it's too much for you. So scientists, they also have this, I would say, poetic view towards the past. And you have to reinterpret the past. You have to understand the past, reinterpret the past, and then use it. So Dreyfus are saying the computers, they cannot do that. So there was a boom already of computer science, mini boom of computer science and philosophy, and people were starting to think about it. And philosophers said, no, this is going nowhere. And then I'm going to quote something really hard by Dreyfus again. He quotes Heidegger. Heidegger is very hard as a philosopher. Heidegger said that philosophy ended because it reached its apex in technology. And on this one, he was right. Absolutely right. Philosophy, in fact, reached its limit with AI. I'm quoting Dreyfus. The scientists inherit our question. What is the mind? Now they have to answer for it. And maybe this is where we are now. Because if we have philosophers and scientists together asking, what is AI now that there is apparently a boom of AI started in the US and the Chinese are catching up. So then these deep philosophical questions, we have to start asking ourselves all over again. And certainly is not this configuration of AI as a tool to establish a coercive social system controlled by an elite.
So basically, you know, you've mentioned a lot of different moving pieces, and I want to try and help bring them together for our viewers. So on the one hand, AI is deeply flawed because it lacks certain essential things that the human intellect has, like reflective intellect.
Reflective.
And I mean, so AI will always inherently be inferior in a certain sense and incomplete to natural human intellect. But due to its massive computing power, if weaponized in the hands of a small group of oligarchs, it can unleash massive tyrannical powers on a general populace. Am I missing anything?
No, you're not, Dimitri. It's absolutely correct. And then maybe we could do a small tentative comparison with what the Chinese did with the deep sea.
I definitely want to get to that, but before moving on to the Chinese, right? You mentioned the sort of evolution of techno-feudalism. It began as basically a national security research project during the Cold War.
Yes.
Over time, these technologies developed. How did they find themselves in the hands of a few oligarchs? Why isn't it that we don't have, you know, a genuine free market with all sorts of mini tech startups? Why does it seem that the tech space is dominated by a few giants?
It's an excellent question, Dimitri, because none of us know what kind of separate deals and specific deals each of these tech giants made with the deep state, with DARPA, and with all this matrix of the deep state deeply involved in ultra high tech. We don't know. We know the results. We know when we see SpaceX or Skylink. We know why Bezos has an absolute monopoly, as he managed to establish with Amazon. We don't know the real reasons for that. In the case of Facebook, we know, and we even have a date. Let me just go back to the date. This was a DARPA program called LifeLog that happened to be discontinued the day Facebook was born. And obviously, nobody asked this question to Zuckerberg directly, right? But this is something that was even revealed by the former Bible of the digital era, the Wired magazine in the US. I used to read Wire every month, in fact, and they had outstanding stuff for years. And Wired was the first one who actually published that this LifeLog DARPA program was discontinued the day that Facebook was born. I have the exact date here, but I cannot find it, Dimitri. But this is very easy. It's very easy to find. Coming back to your question, why these 5 or 6 guys? No?
Yeah.
Because it's, once again, it depended on what kind of deals they struck individually with DARPA and the deep state. And it's quite different from the Chinese model where you have, for instance, a guy who worked as a hedge fund manager. He starts DeepSeek to concentrate on an AI model. He uses only local talent, not imported talent from the Ivy League, only young Chinese researchers. He comes up with something that is faster, cheaper, and in fact free for everybody. And at the same time, paying attention to Chinese government guidelines. You have to do something that benefits people, not benefits shareholders or oligarchs. So this is a completely different model.
And so is DeepSeek sort of anomaly, or is it more broadly representative of the Chinese model of technological development and innovation?
Exactly. It's more representative of the Chinese model because it's inbuilt and it's part of this overarching program the Chinese call Made in China 2025, which they started basically 10 years ago, started to pick up during Trump 1.0. When Trump started looking at China, he freaked out and he launched the first big package of sanctions in 2018, his second year in power, right? And nothing worked because the Chinese absorbed the sanctions. They knew that they would have to come up with their own semiconductor industry at the highest level. So this is what they have been doing. Huawei, which was slapped with horrible sanctions, a few years later, they come up with the best smartphone on the planet ahead of everybody else, and everybody was, how did they do it? That's when you have central planning with targets based on meritocracy, no corruption because, no, I want to get a special deal with this agency. No. They have to follow the overarching organization, the targets, research. They have all the extra funds they need because the central government gives you extra research funds if you need it, which was the case in Huawei. They used all the money that they had, but Chinese government helped Huawei because they saw that how Huawei was in dire straits. And in this case of DeepSeek, it's even extraordinary. He used his own money from his own hedge fund, which was nothing. It was a few $1 million compared to the billions, the tens of or hundreds of trillions of dollars used by big tech in the US. So it's a completely different model. It's people-oriented, and it's directly linked to central planning targets.
So you have the government providing guidance, but you don't have a collusion between big business and big government in the way that you see what in Silicon Valley.
Absolutely. That's why it's a completely different model. And it's no wonder, Dimitri, that when DeepSeek, which is a small company with a small model, comes out, not out of nowhere, because scientists in China were paying attention. You saw the absolute chaos on Silicon Valley and Wall Street at the same time, because they, and the thing is, this Rundian thinking, it's so widespread, and they think they're invulnerable on top of it. It's like, the future, the tech future and the AI future is going to be us, the leaders. Not necessary. Now you have direct competition.
And how are the Chinese able to avoid the sort of collusion between big government and big business? What did they do differently to produce a more efficient and less corrupt model of technological innovation?
There are many reasons. One of them is quite straightforward. Ultra first-class tech and math expertise. Meaning better students, better prepared, working 22 hours a day, disciplined and with focus. And, reaching the target. So, it's very impressive. It's a very Confucianist way of seeing the world. It's hard study, discipline, respect for the elders. It's totally Chinese the way they approach. And of course, and the Deng Xiaoping element, crossing the river while filling the stones. Okay, we tried this model. If it doesn't work, today we start another one, and then we hit the right model. That's how they do it.
But is it just a question of better specialists? Or is there some sort of stuff on the institutional level that makes the institutions work better, right? Because even when you have talented people, right? If the institutions suck, these people are not going to be able to fully self-realize their potential.
Exactly. For instance, it's fascinating how this guy from DeepSeek, Liang Wenfeng, he said, "Now we're not copying anymore. Now we are innovating." So you install this frame of mind, this new program in your circle of new researchers and young researchers, they'll go for it. It becomes a mission. And it becomes a mission not only for the good of the company, but to have something that will be for the good of the overall community. So it's the absolute opposite of techno-feudalism, in fact,
I think you're missing a very important point that I think we need to emphasize. I think part of the reason why China was able to develop this sort of more flexible, dynamic, and less, in some ways, ironically centralized technological model is because China is an autocracy, whereas the US is a quote-unquote democracy. And because China is an autocracy, somewhere, around 2018, 2019, or not even later, around 2022, 2023, Xi Jinping looked at the tech landscape and he said, I see a disproportionate concentration of power, right? This guy, Jack Ma, has way too much money, way too much power.
Exactly.
And some of these companies like Tencent, they've gotten a little bit too fat for their own good. So I'm going to take them down a notch. I'm going to introduce various regulations, take a little bit piece there, take a little bit piece there, and I'm going to bring them back under the control and under the guidance of the state so that they don't become, these powerful, self-interested entities, but they remain focused on the overall national strategic goal. And at the time, I think you remember, many of our viewers remember, people in the Western media were absolutely freaking out. They said Xi Jinping's destroying China's tech sector. He's destroying China's economic model. He's taking, China several steps back. But now we see what's happening with DeepSeek. We see other technological breakthroughs that they're making. And we realize that actually he's made the right decision. That he's actually, saved China from becoming prisoners of this dysfunctional technological oligarchy.
Absolutely correct when it comes to Jack Ma. I remember very well when Trump came to power in early 2017, Jack Ma was a mega superstar, not only China, in Asia, but even in the US. And after a few months, Xi Jinping and the Politburo, they were looking around and said, no, we don't want to replicate what was already the techno-feudal American system. We want to encourage several nodes of excellence and not an overarching control by a mega corporation. So this was the right decision because it was let's say, the Chinese socialist decision, to put it bluntly. But in terms of several nodes of expertise working towards a common goal. It's always towards a common goal. And when we see, for instance, DeepSeek, they put their model online for free. They're not charging anybody.
You're totally right, but I do think it's interesting to note that certain libertarians like investor Peter Schiff, who I had on the show a couple of months ago, I asked him about the, US economic model, Chinese economic model, which one was better? And Peter Schiff said, Chinese economic model is way better because it has far less bureaucratic red tape. It's, far more, he said they do free market capitalism better than the United States does. So, I do think that this is one of the unique factors of Chinese market socialism, where on the one hand, due to the fact that they get rid of these oligarchies and these monopolies, they allow for more competition, more dynamic medium enterprises, small enterprises, startups. But at the same time, as you mentioned, there is this sort of larger strategic hand guiding the whole process so that people focus on innovation in the places where it actually matters instead of developing, stupid apps that get you addicted to them all day long.
Exactly, Dimitri. And the overarching frame of mind and guideline is Made in China 2025. Which, when Trump slapped the sanctions, the first batch, they stopped calling it Made in China 2025. They kept doing what they were doing, which is, let's concentrate in all these high-tech sectors, and we're going to be number one in 2035 in most of them. They already are. In AI, they are catching up fast with the US. In other sectors, they are already number one, like solar panels, electric vehicles, you name it. So if you don't have this long-term vision, you cannot build a system that is going to improve you technologically and at the same time benefit the maximum number of people for an acceptable cost. And this is what the Chinese do.
You mentioned an interesting thing, that the alarm bells in the United States started with the first Trump term.
Yes.
I want to return back to the evolution of the American techno-feudalists. Because as you mentioned, they were created basically by the US deep state in the lab.
Absolutely.
They emerged as these sort of Randian capitalists. But when I think back to the 2010s and even the first Trump term, the big tech world were basically globalist liberals.
Yes.
They loved Barack Obama. They were constantly fraternizing with the Obama administration. And during the first Trump administration, they clearly were disturbed by his nationalist populist rhetoric. And they initially were very cooperative with the Biden administration. But it seems as though a switch flipped in 2024, and we saw it with the endorsement of Elon Musk. We see it with the defection of Mark Zuckerberg. We see it with some other, people in the big tech community coming out and openly supporting Trump. Why did this happen? Why did this ideological evolution happen? Was it purely cynical opportunism, or is there some other objective force driving this shift in worldview?
It's a mix of both. Cynical opportunism, because they saw that the tide had turned. So they had to align with his master's voice, of course, number one. But number two, at the same time, they see that now they have free reign as, let's say, techno-feudalist masters, because the Trump administration is giving them free reign. Now they can do literally anything they want, because they are the let's say, if this was a modern version of Plato's Republic, the sages, the tech sages are them. Very rarefied, only a few. We can include Peter Thiel as well. Peter Thiel is a very dangerous character. Peter Thiel is a guy who is basically killing people, weaponizing artificial intelligence with the programs that he sells to the Israelis in Palestine. So it's still very rarefied. And now they see unlimited opportunities. So it's back to Ayn Rand, Dimitri, over and over again. And now we have the Randian superhero, full flight.
I think it's kind of ironic because, again, as you made clear throughout this conversation, the techno-feudalist big tech is a product of the U.S. deep state. But it seems that big tech has become the U.S. deep state's Frankenstein monster. Because now we see Elon Musk and his team of tech-savvy 19-year-olds barging down the doors at various U.S. government institutions, from USAID, State Department, Department of Education, and now the Pentagon. And he says, we're going to optimize you. We're going to get rid of waste. We're going to make you unnecessary. And so what do you make of the sort of looming clash between the big tech oligarchy and the U.S. deep state? Why did the big tech oligarchy turn against its parent?
Because the parent is not serving them anymore, essentially. And now that they can theoretically have unlimited global opportunities offered directly by the presidency, and one of them is actually running parts of the US government. First, literally the sky is the limit for them, and the skies also includes, for instance, policing the skies, weaponizing the skies, extra contracts with the deep state to exactly police most of the planet. We don't know how widespread this will be because it will depend on possible successes by the Trump administration on the international arena, which everywhere we see disasters looming. Be it West Asia, be it with China, be it with Russia. The only area where it's guaranteed is the don't roll doctrine, right? Yeah. They will control the Western Hemisphere, whatever it takes. But apart from that, nothing is acquired in terms of Trump's foreign policy and Trump's influence in the rest of the world. And this will go in parallel with the big tech influence. In Europe, they can colonize or continue colonizing Europe the way they want, because I don't see the European Commission having the power to go against the American big tech. They can't. And if they legislate, it's very simple. They're going to lose market. They're going to lose... they're going to provoke even civil revolt in many European countries, because Europeans are also users of American big tech. And they won't give up because the European Commission tells them to,
There's one other problem that I see looming for the techno-feudalist besides geopolitical chaos. And to sell this point home, I want to use an obscure historical analogy. I'm sure that most of our viewers have at least heard of the 30 Years' War in Europe, right, which was this sort of massive power struggle between the Catholics and the Protestants for control over the territory of modern-day Germany. And the chief player on the Catholic side was the Holy Roman Empire, led by the Habsburgs. The Habsburgs had a serious problem. They were broke. So they didn't have the money to finance the large army necessary to fight off an entire coalition of Protestant armies. And so to come to the rescue came this obscure nobleman by the name of Albrecht von Wallenstein. Now, Wallenstein had a lot of cash, but he didn't have a lot of status, he didn't have a lot of titles, he didn't have a lot of land. And so he went over to the Habsburgs and said, look, I'll build you an army, I'll finance your government, but what I want in return is that when we come and reconquer these sort of German lands, I want a share of the land. And I want titles. I want political power, and I want rent-controlling assets. And the Habsburgs were willing to give it because beggars can be choosers. And so Wallenstein played a critical role in helping the Habsburgs regain the initiative in the war against the Protestants. But as time went on, the Habsburgs realized that Wallenstein, not they, were becoming the true masters of the Holy Roman Empire. And at that point, they understood that they had to risk it all in order to get rid of Wallenstein. Because if they continued as it is, they would be destroyed and Wallenstein would become the de facto emperor. And again, I see a sort of certain equivalent dynamic between Trump and Elon Musk. Because Trump, during his first term, he realized that he didn't have enough institutional clout, enough of elite support in order to quash the US deep state. So that's why he's basically calling in big tech as his heavy cavalry in this battle. But this is not going to come free, because basically we're going to see Elon Musk push various agendas that strengthen his own business interest, his own political power. And I think that at a certain point, Trump will have to choose. Does he want to be President Trump, or basically the sort of ceremonial figure enacting Shadow President Musk's agenda?
It's a very good point, Dimitri, because if this happens, let's say within the next, let's say the last 2 years of his presidency, he'll be thinking about legacy. He'll be thinking, okay, I'm not going to run again anyway. What will be my legacy? Would still be MAGA. Would be very hard to accomplish MAGA the way he wants to accomplish it. The US might be in an advanced stage of civil war by then, 3 or 4 years from now. But he could always boast that the high-tech future of the United States was assured by him as president. So this will be his way out, let's put it this way. Musk is in a very comfortable position because whatever happens, his only way is up. Internally, of course, because he's already running parts of the government, and in the wider world, because his projects will be, literally being bought by governments, as they already are all over the world. And in terms of AI, and in terms of AI organizing social relations, this is also spreading like this, even with the competition of the Chinese model, which is more, let's say, socially oriented. But for Musk and for the others, for the other, let's say, the high-tech gang, I say the future is Rundian happy, to put it mildly. This is objectively speaking and looking at how they can still colonize the minds that they had not colonized by now,
I mean, we'll have to live and learn and see how it plays out. But I think that, we are in season 5 of the Raging 20s. So far, we haven't been bored. This has been a high energy TV show. And I want to thank you, Pepe, for joining us today. Once again, helping us see the big picture beyond all the smoke and mirrors.
My pleasure, Dimitri. My pleasure. Thank you.